Okay, are we good? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Hi everybody. Welcome to Place Scrutiny Committee, the first one. We haven't got any members of the public, so I won't go for any of the background stuff in terms of where people need to go. So I'll just move on. We've just got one apologies today. That's Councillor Taylor, who's been substituted by Councillor Coles. So I'll move on to item 2, which is declarations of interest. Does anyone have anything to declare today for this meeting? Nope. Great. We'll move on again then. And third item is public participation. I believe we've got one speaker today. She's Flick Williams joining us online. So you know the process, Flick. So if you want to speak when you're ready, just go from there.
When I registered to speak today, I registered for the not yet updated on the form Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. I should like to begin by thanking Councillor Taylor as the outgoing chair for genuinely listening to the concerns raised by disabled people and supporting our requests. I very much hope the new chair will continue in the same vein. In light of what I've come to speak about today, it seems that removal of access from the title of this scrutiny committee is perhaps a retrograde step, as it is perhaps needed as an essential aid memoir. So, criteria for the Parks Investment Fund. I've read every word of the accompanying papers. No contributions from either the Equalities Manager or the Access Officer. Perhaps that is why there is not one single mention anywhere of access to the parks themselves for disabled people, be they disabled adults, parents or children. King George's Park on the bordering Guildhall and Heworth Ward springs to mind. Only stepped access at the main entrance closest to the children's play equipment and no meaningful access elsewhere, as the concrete lip at the entrance halfway down makes it inaccessible, and the hazardous narrow angled steps at the other end, together with the gradient of the informally created desire line track, similarly so. It should be obvious when using indices of social deprivation that these will include a higher proportion of both disabled adults and children than the general population. So the need for accessibility to all parks and green spaces needs to be clearly spelled out. And then we get to the play equipment itself. Not every piece of equipment can be accessible to every child, but play equipment has advanced enormously over the last 20 years, and much work has been done on this by a number of inclusion groups. Look to work done by Southwark, Wandsworth, Ilford and Norfolk. The UK Access Association has produced a publicly available inclusive play manifesto. It begins, the Access Association calls on all stakeholders to work collaboratively, engaging with communities and actively consulting with them to create a future where every play space is designed with accessibility and inclusivity at its heart, ensuring that no child nor young adult is left behind in the enjoyment and benefits of play. We advocate that public funding of play areas should be dependent on the development of a robust inclusive design strategy. I concur. So why is there no commitment to this set out in your criteria? I would urge you elected members to add it before it goes to the executive. We hear endless repetition of the commitment to equalities, yet the detail is always missing. Why is it always down to disabled people to have to show up and point out what your strategies miss? It should be automatic by now that access and inclusion is incontrovertibly part of everything you do, every strategy you devise, every decision you make. Disappointing once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. That's helpful information. I'm sure we'll take it into account as we move forward. So thanks for your time. We'll move on to the first item, which is Park Investment Fund. Today we're joined by a number of people if you just want to introduce yourself when you're speaking. But yeah, if you want to talk us through anything on the report specifically, and then we'll open up for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll just, Holt, Head of Environmental Services. I'll just provide a summary of where we are and why we're here with this report today for committee. So we really welcome the 500k investment into this area. We feel it's been long overdue. We've put together, we've agreed a process in terms of trying to come up with a criteria for the open spaces, green, play areas, etc. And come up with that criteria that we can then use to determine which places would meet that criteria. So the proposal is that we're seeking some comments today from yourselves as a committee. This will then feed into an executive report in July and a further report in September that would then outline and determine the places that meet that criteria or agreed criteria. So we've listed some criteria in the report, which we can talk through, and happy to field any questions. I won't list them now. I'm sure there's plenty of questions around that. So yeah, we're just asking committee today to provide comments on what is the proposed criteria and any kind of analysis and weighting and comments around that as well.
Thank you. Before I go out to anyone who has a question, can I just, for a bit of background, probably to yourself, Dave, what would 500k look like along with Section 106 contributions and other bits, just to give people an idea of what we might be looking at for being able to, before we decide on it, I guess.
Right, Dave Meath, Public Realm, so as long-term parks manager with the council. What does it look like? It looks like a lot of improved sites is the short answer. So if you were starting from a completely new play area, we're probably talking about £60,000. If you were, so for example, the most recent one we built was Navigation Road, Rosemary Place, next to City Walls. That was about £35,000 worth of spend. There are things in here though that are not specifically suggestions about play areas. So until it's a bit chicken. This is all very chicken and egg. So until we get a steer, I've not done huge amounts of background research and checking as to what we'll get. But in terms of play areas, that's what you're looking at. So £40,000 to £60,000 will get you a new play area. Yeah, there's the suggestions here about footpath works, which could be £20,000. It depends how long a piece of footpath it is repairing or rebuilding.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Looking for any questions from committee members on this. Yeah, Councillor Whitcroft, and then Councillor Coles.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a couple, but I'm happy to ask one and then move along. But I did want to draw attention to what the public speaker mentioned there, drawing attention to the impact of access and making sure that parks are there for everyone to use. And I see in the report we are still awaiting the comments coming back from the Equalities Officer, under presumably whom this remit would fall. But I feel it might be quite useful for this committee to understand what equalities considerations that we've got sort of from the outset out of this report, and particularly making sure that we've got, when this comes to the executive, not only do we have a response from the Equalities Officer specifically focusing on access, but also perhaps the chance for us at Scrutiny to discuss the access implications of this report. I don't know if there's any further detail you could potentially give us ahead of the Equalities Officer.
We're still awaiting a response. The timetable we found for this has been quite, tight, to say the least. So, in terms of, as Flick was saying, you've got to get to a site or get into a site. You've got to get round a site, and then what is there at that site. And the example she used was King Charles V playing field. That is probably the worst place we have by historical quirk. That is the worst place, or historical bad decision making, whichever way you want to look at it. So for me, just picking on your patch, you've got Cemetery Road play area, so it's getting into the site, from the footpath, level entrances, gates, width of gates, self-opening gates, to what is there when you get in, from seating to particular equipment that can be used. And as Flick said, not every piece of kit is suitable for everybody, but is there a range of opportunity for a variety of users? And that's just focusing on play equipment. Some of this is more just access to the site and what you're going to do when you get to the site. Now that may be, we're fortunate, that most of our sites in York are flat. We have very few steps in our parks, and in the main there are alternatives around those sort of obstacles or barriers. We have things, and clearly other people we can. Again, it's a bit chicken and egg. Depending on what's selected, then we work on fine tuning that, select that scheme. We have handrails in place, but are they the right height now? Are they the right? Is the colour scheme right? I don't know, but it depends on what's chosen. We would then work up the more detail to meet, suitable standards. As you imagine, I get approached by a lot of play equipment companies quite often, and they're all trying to sell me this, and they're all saying, look at our range, look at all these nice shiny things you can have. And they're very mindful, the design industry, the supplier industry is very mindful of activity needs, whether that's, visual, sensual mobility, physical mobility. There's, the range of equipment now is far different than it was 5, 10, certainly 20 years ago. One of the things we're recommending is we focus on, I'm suggesting, should say really, is recommend some of the older sites are some of our priorities, or sites with older equipment, so that can be brought up to a modern, appropriate standard. Don't know if that helped.
Yeah. And would there be scope within what we're discussing here with the extra 500k to sort of improve that accessibility for areas where it currently isn't?
I think at the moment I can't. There's two ways of doing it. One is the other one or more of the other criteria are a priority, and then you find your schemes and then incorporate accessibility within that scheme. Or you have accessibility as a criteria in itself to determine which schemes come forward. And that's this basically what you're talking about is my work program for the next few months. Is once we have a steer on the criteria, then I'll be working up some kind of matrix spreadsheet as to the opportunities and the barriers across the estate, the council's estate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mee, for that. I appreciate we're a long way off recommendations at the moment, but when it comes to that, I would certainly recommend access be one of the top priorities for when we're deciding criteria or recommending criteria to the executive chair.
I saw a couple of hands go up. Are any of those supplementary, or are they just added to the? No, great. Yeah. All right, Councillor Coles, please.
Thanks, Chair. It's a really welcome report, so thank you for that. One of my questions was just it looks like your definition of a park is quite wide because you're talking about play areas across the city. I was just interested in whether you've looked at, as well as the state of the current and existing play areas and parks, whether you've also looked at where there might be gaps in particular areas, and particularly where, for example, somewhere might have a pocket park because of a development and some money that's come from developers, but actually what was probably needed in that space was something bigger and better than a pocket park. So just whether it's as much about gaps as it is about improving existing equipment, notwithstanding that I recognise that money is limited in scope. So just what your thinking was around that, if I can start with that.
I've not considered sort of spatial gaps. The local plan evidence base does map where play areas green space is and sets distances, travel times, and estimate sort of a threshold of travel times. I think in the last significant, the last government funded play funded investment called Play Builder did address a lot of the gaps in provision in terms of locality and play areas particularly. So the city is pretty well covered, apart from a few ends of a few communities with play provision. The issue we always had is, do we own the land, and can we get hold of land in terms of a new play area? If you're talking about parks, then the budget just goes out the window, isn't anywhere near sufficient because of the cost of acquiring land, and then we're into future maintenance obligations as well. So it's not something I've considered. Does that cover all the points?
Yes, and if I could just ask another question. Sure. So just to pick up on Flick Williams' point around accessibility, some of that is about the equipment itself, but as I think you said in response to Conrad's question, it's also about access to the space itself. So if I just think about my own ward, we have Chesney Fields, which has good access, but very aging and poor equipment on it. But we also have Westfield Marsh, which has very poor access to it and in it. So there's kind of I guess it's how you measure that, and I would certainly support having that accessibility point prioritised somewhere in that criteria. And then just on the criteria themselves, if I may, the green flag and availability of external funds weighting. I wonder whether that was green flags having it or aspiring to have it. So whether that was something that you might assess separately, and also what you were constituting as external funds and the availability of it, and again, whether that was a positive thing or not. Is that about match funding, or actually shouldn't we be supporting the places that don't have access to match funding because actually they possibly need it more from the council than other places? I wasn't quite sure what that meant, if you could clarify.
Talk about accessibility first. What was the name of the first site you mentioned? I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that.
Chesney Field.
Okay, Chesnesfield, right. So as you imagine, every site's got its own history and sort of quirks. So Westfield Marsh or Grange Lane was a conscious filling in of previous gap in provision. Ideally, I would have preferred it to be on the top of the slope and quite close to the road, but because that has got landscape value, the grassland, so it's not immediately obvious that grassland has wildlife biodiversity value. The place that was agreed on to put it was down the bottom of the hill, which is the worst place for access, but the best place for landscape value. So there's all these quirks across the city that we're trying to balance out. Green flag was, I suppose, neutral in terms of whether it's a site that has it and it would benefit retaining it, or a site that doesn't have it and has potential to acquire one, meet the core criteria. External funding, that could be either literally an external grant with there's talk of you've got natural English heritage might be interested in funding some of the work. Don't know. I haven't worked up the scoring matrix yet, so I suppose I answer that was I don't know that whether it's positive or negative.
Can I just follow up on that? Sorry, Chair. Just on the external funds, the thing that would concern me is what you don't want to do is exacerbate the difference between communities who have friends of groups and are organised versus the communities who perhaps don't have those groups. And that doesn't mean that their play areas and their parks don't need the investment. It just means that actually they rely on the local authority to do that much more than, say, a park where there's a friends of group or whatever, where they might be able to apply for funding. So I'd just be a little bit concerned about whether or not you might exacerbate inequality by inadvertently encouraging support.
That certainly wasn't the intent.
I'm sure it wasn't.
And that's why this sort of suggestions here is that it's not the first criteria is can we get money from somebody else and we'll top it up. It's actually at the end of the criteria we're waiting.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Kenny, why to come in then?
Yes, just to come back on that, if it's good to clarify that, because I think the intent behind that, my understanding of it is that what we don't want to do is spend money where other people might be able to spend money for us. So Section 106 money that hasn't been unspent, we want to be really clear that we've bottomed out all of that first and spent that first. And it might be that we top it up with this fund, but we don't want to displace existing funding. Likewise, we want to put more effort into looking for external partners in terms of grants. And so Dave's mentioned the Lottery Heritage Fund, and some of the works that might potentially come under these schemes or improvements might be funded by that. So we actually want to apply for grants or put more energy into that. So it's additionality rather than displacing, because absolutely we don't want to exacerbate inequality. But this was directed that way, that we've got more money to spend on sites where there is no other form of spend at all.
Is that what you were going to add? I would like to come in.
Very similar point. Patrick Lipker, Assistant Director of Finance. It's really, we'll do some cross-referencing the Section 106s. So, for example, if we've got a site where, and this is hypothetical, there's £20,000 to spend on play equipment in Bell Farm, the scheme that scores highest within Bell Farm across the categories that you go with will almost certainly say, well, actually, we'll allocate that 20,000 Section 106 against that, so we're not using council funding if it was at the top of the list. So it might jump up the list because we've got external funding that needs to be used in a particular geographical location. So we will be cross-referencing, checking those as to how that works through.
Thanks. Was yours a supplementary to that? So no, grand. Councillor Fenton, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. I think one of the things it kind of helpfully clarified for me was the scope of the scheme, because I think initially it was a parks investment. I thought unless it's a formal park, then it wouldn't be eligible. My reading of this, it's not just parks, it's areas of open space, it's playgrounds. So that's helpful clarification. Just a few kind of comments and observations. Paragraph 13, there's reference to removing old fencing. People get very, fences can be very contentious, particularly fences around play areas, for a number of reasons. I suppose what I hope that doesn't mean is that fencing will be removed without consultation because it's old, because many people value fencing in order to keep dogs out of playgrounds. Some people use fencing to contain dogs within playgrounds, but that's not the purpose. So, but just usually, if you could set my mind at rest that there's not going to be an abolition of fences around playgrounds. In terms of the prioritisation factors, which I don't have any issues with. I think the one thing to bear in mind in terms of proximity to communities with a higher IMD score, there are play areas, certainly in my ward, which serve a wider area. For example, the Woodthorpe Primary School has a playground next to it that's very well used by children from Woodthorpe, Foxwood and the wider area. So there may be, and York is a patchwork, and that's what makes it such a great place, is looking at sort of catchment for some of the playgrounds. I mean, luckily we were able to use a combination of central council funding and ward funding to invest in Woodthorpe Playground in 4 or 5 years ago, pre-COVID, I think. So there may be opportunities where there are play areas that serve a wider community, which otherwise might not score highly. So I suppose is there a degree of flexibility that you can apply when looking at those? Just picking up the point of looking to lever in external funding. I think the point was well made around some communities not having, I don't have parish councils, so that's one area which is not an avenue of funding that's open. In previous years we've had ward capital funding to supplement any other funds, any ward funding that we've had. It'd be helpful to understand Section 106 funding. I'm sure Dave has a map plotted of unspent 106 money that could be used on play areas. I know there's one in my ward I'm very keen to see spent. So it might be useful to share some of that information. And finally, I'd like to see an explicit reference in the report to engaging with ward councillors and community groups. I don't see how that would do any harm in terms of informing any plans that come forward. So just a few observations.
Thanks. Councillor Myers, please.
Thank you, Chair. A quick comment would be to ask to just put on record, I think as others have, about the importance of accessibility in play areas, and that includes, as mentioned, getting to play areas, but also the installation of accessible play equipment. I think I really do need to press that. And it's linked to a second point and question for my information and the committee's information about our current play strategy. I think it's probably, unless I'm mistaken, more than 10 years old. 2012, I think, is our play strategy, and it might be one that we could bring up on our work programme if members felt
necessary, but I did want to ask officers if it's that strategy that we're still working on, because things like accessible play equipment don't feature as strongly on that strategy as what they should if we were to relook at it now. So that's one question. I'll do a quick second question about deliverability. I think the 2021 investment into play equipment across the city was £100,000. This is 500,000, and it's much welcome. But I wanted to ask, of that 100,000 4 years ago, I believe there were 30 different sites that were allocated funding out of that amount. And I wondered if, without making criticism, just asking, are they all delivered? And then the question would beg, can we deliver on a 5-fold increase in investment?
Yeah, please.
We'll do a double act for a bit, and then I'll try and come back to some of the other questions. From of the last tranche of council money, all but 3 have been delivered. So 27 out of the 30, whatever the exact numbers were, and the remaining money is still sat in a pot and will be delivered on.
Thanks.
In terms of this fund, in terms of delivery, it is recognised that it's obviously considerably more than 4 or 5 years ago. So we will be funding a project manager or officer out of this for around 18 months. So it'll be a fixed term post to support Dave in the delivery of that, because obviously we want to, we know the importance of ensuring that this investment's completed. So that is that process is underway as we speak.
Thanks. Yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, I'll just add that, but to some extent, it will also determine what level of schemes comes out of this. So let's say there's 100 play areas and parks on the list, because I can do maths easily with 100, and there's £400,000 once you've taken the project officer out for 18 months or so. You're looking at £4,000 per area. If you're delivering 100 areas at £4,000, that's going to take a huge amount of delivery in terms of the amount of consultation you've got to take in for 100 areas. If, and this is purely hypothetical, you were to do 4 schemes each of £100,000, the consultation would be a lot less, or it'd be a lot more thorough in those individual areas. So to some extent, it's how thinly you spread it over a wide geographical area, or is it about some particular areas making a very significant difference? And that ultimately is a member decision, which we're looking for your sort of input into.
Thanks. Are you happy with that? Councillor Vassey, please.
Thank you, Chair. So officers will be aware that I asked for a list of the parks and play areas and whatever to help inform this discussion, because I think while we're all familiar with stuff in our own wards, it's actually quite difficult to have a citywide view. So I regret that there wasn't something that helped us have that view. Access to play areas, I accept and agree with the points made by the public speaker and by others, for those with mobility problems and etc. The kind of areas that, looking through the list and the criteria, that I thought from my ward I can contribute to, as I say, in the absence of understanding everything else, I was struck by the fact that all the parks that were listed are all in the city, and I get that. And I get that there's a general view that people in the villages tend to be well off and there aren't areas of deprivation. What I'm aware of, though, is that when you get to the villages, there's only one player area you can go to. There aren't several in different directions. Furthermore, many of the communities have very poor public transport systems. On a Sunday, Elvington and Weldrake have nothing at all. So if you're a young family who don't have a car, on a Sunday, you've actually got only the play area in Weldrake available. And I think that needs to be a criteria when looking at what needs money spending on. It's the ability of local residents and children to access play areas and to make sure that those play areas sustain all the things that children need, given that they've only got one. Again, in my ward, 3 of the villages have play areas, 1 has nothing. Deaton does have a bus service though, so you could argue that they can go in and use other options in the city. But so that consideration of access and public transport and how far you have to walk, again, because in some villages, and I can't comment on other villages, and maybe others can do that, but in Elvington, some people in what you might characterise as the less well-off parts of Elvington have a walk of at least 1 kilometre to get to the play area that there is. And it may be that in the future, thinking about bringing some provision, extra provision, closer to those particular developments might be a very good thing to do, because there are lots of children in those particular areas. Lastly, if I may, Chair, just wanted to add something about the Section 106 agreements, because points have been well made about how that contributes. I think having had access to that list would have helped me understand how that fits more broadly. But many of us are aware that a recent audit of Section 106 has shown that there's a likelihood that various opportunities have been missed in the past years to ensure that all departments are brought in when developments are being considered. And I don't know if that affects to your area, but I am mindful of the risk that developments can be approved without areas such as yours being given full opportunity to flesh out what the potential benefits would be from investing or getting a Section 106 contribution to those play areas. And we've also heard from that audit that there is subsequently a problem spending the money once it's been received, and I'm sure others have more experience than I. But so both of those areas do need addressing to make sure that the council's money is used to its best, and Section 106 agreements are always spent and not left hanging in limbo.
Yeah, Councillor Kent.
So I'll let officers reply as to whether historically they feel they've been sufficiently consulted in development applications for things like play areas and parks and open spaces. Going forwards, I'm sure everybody hears this loud and clear, and will make great efforts that they are consulted. In relation to spending Section 106, I think everyone in this room is as frustrated about historic failures in this, and we're very keen to spend the money that's sitting there. And part of the background of including that in this is because if there's a project officer for this, they can also look at getting that money spent, because it's ridiculous that it's sitting still. And we want it in our communities, improving pride of place, improving our public spaces, our play areas, not sitting in a bank account wasting.
Yep, I don't say anything.
I think from planning colleagues always try and consult with us, you know, so I don't have a particular problem there. Spending has been issued because of work priorities, you know, what is expected of and asked of the service. And probably for 10 years or more, there's been a mismatch of resource available to spend versus the ask of what's required from you. Very little, if any, money's ever been sent back. Money that we retain gains interest. Because of the change in the thresholds when payments were required, it did early days generate a lot of very small schemes that you had to pool to be able to spend on a particular scheme, and then you're relying on a scheme being developed that was of enough sort of critical mass to be able to deliver on it. Undoubtedly, there is some money that wants spending and or used, but it all has been, and I'm sure will be used.
Thanks. Karen.
I'll just add to that, as you know, the capacity in this area has basically been down for a number of years, and the opportunity to have this project officer will allow project officer to do a lot of work in terms of building up the detail of what these schemes actually are, and then it actually allows Dave to have some further capacity, or the service to have further capacity to do some of this other areas. So one of the issues we've always had with Section 106 is yes, it's great, we can go out and get the money, but all the Section 106 can fund is the actual equipment and the infrastructure. It can't fund the actual activity to install that equipment and to do all the work and the consulting, and that, as you all know, that is very time consuming to get that investment right. So we're just seeing this as a really good opportunity to sort of significantly build up the team to allow more than one pot of funding to actually get spent in this area.
Thanks. We've got Councillor Healy next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Two broad points, really. Point 10, where you go, the Council's Business Intelligence Unit has provided IMD scores for the area in a 500-metre radius surrounding York's open spaces, etc. Could I make a suggestion? That works really well for like community parks, so say Scarcroft or Lower Priory Street. It doesn't work very well for what I would consider to be like a city park. So like Homestead Park, you go there, whereas I wouldn't imagine anyone ever goes to the Lower Priory Street playground, for instance. And the same with Roundtrees Park, you know, people will go there. So that works for your little parks, but I'm guessing we've probably got 5 or 6 of these sort of more citywide parks. And essentially just, you're going to have to do something smart where you sort of IMD it by gradually moving the boundaries together and including what includes in. So just to make that a bit more smart, I don't think it's very smart at the moment, in essence. So that's one recommendation. The second one, on point 22, you need a lot more detail on how this is going to work. So point 22 is your weighting, how you're going to be weighting. So I'm guessing what you're going to have is like a table that has all of the parks across the top, and then your criteria down the side. And then if you put them in order, and then you go to the next thing and you sort of say, well, okay, then I've ordered my sites by IMD. And now I've written down replacing play equipment over 20 years. You might get halfway down that first row. I don't get the impression that that's how it's going to work. So, you know, just how is this going to work? Because I can't, it sounds like a lot of money, £500,000, but I'm guessing that to do all of these things here across the entire state, you probably need 5 million. So just a bit more detail on how that scoring mechanism is going to work.
I think how we see it is effectively having the parks down one side, and then we would score them, each one of them, against these criteria. So everyone would get a score against this criteria, which then would give you a total score for that particular location. And the top ones we would work on in terms of what really needs delivering in those areas. So I'll leave Dave to sort of give details on what it is we'd actually do.
You've just described it. I think that, again, it's this chicken and egg thing, because I haven't spent a vast amount of time on this, because, you know, you as a committee or you as the executive could say, no, go away and do something else. But you know, you've got the list of sites. I think I digress slightly. I think the amalgamation for probably the top 5 or 6, probably, but slightly more than that, maybe 7 or 8 more. It's a bit big to say regional, but you know, a bigger catchment. That's an interesting thing to explore. But then I think if you allocate a score, you know, 1 to 5, the most deprived get 5, the most oldest equipment gets 5. If it's a lesser need for new equipment, 3. If we add in a column for accessibility is really poor, then it scores 5. As Patrick said, you add it up and somebody's going to have 25 and somebody may have 15. And we would recommend that the first tranche of fund is allocated to a scheme to resolve those issues.
Yeah, I was going to pick up a similar point. It's not really much a question, but I guess my only thing was, I guess it's a good tool, and there's always that balance, isn't there, in the public sector in particular, of wanting to be able to kind of demonstrate your work in, so that when people ask questions, you can say this is why we chose this park over that park, which is really good, and it's helpful to have that. But also, it should never become a rod to beat your own back with sometimes as well, isn't it? And I'm sure you all have excellent ideas about where money should be spent, and you can apply all of your working knowledge over years of working in the council to identify where the best use of that money is. So I guess it's just getting that balance right of using this criteria, but I think you're going to have to develop it as you start to test it against sites a little bit, because what you'll do is you're going to put it in, aren't you? And you're going to go, God, this part needs spending money on, but it doesn't meet any of the criteria, or it doesn't quite put the bench. So I think it's just allowing yourself that breathing space, really, is all I'd say. While it's good criteria to have, don't be beholden to it. Yeah, Councillor Kent.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, Councillor Burton. I think that's exactly right, because you're right, Councillor Healy. We might end up with 30 parks all scoring maximum, and so we haven't actually selected any, because that's a possible, like, however the weighting comes out. So I guess, not meaning to be trite, but what would you suggest do you have any suggestions about how we could improve either the weightings or the selection criteria, or exercising choice? Because it is difficult, and there is going to be an element of experience applied to this, as Councillor Burton said.
I hadn't put a huge amount of thought into it. I had sort of broken it down into, you'd sort of give IMD, say, 30%, replacing play equipment 25%, key infrastructure 20%, and the last two 10. That's literally just trying to bolster some of the for the others. Then I could do, if someone wants to sit down with me in a spreadsheet, I could probably do this fairly sensibly. But off the top of my head, no. But I would be interested to see the spreadsheet before you present it to the exec. And because I'm sure you're going to want to see it as well. Because my fear is that if you don't tweak the your IMD weighting value, they will literally suck up. There'll be 5 or 6 parks that will just suck up all of the cash. And coming back to Councillor Vassey's point of view, a lot of I'm in a quite fortunate situation, which I'm sure if Councillor Stewart would tell you, that I live in Micklegate. I have access to quite a few little parks, so we do have a choice. But there are communities. Strensville, for instance, only has 1 park, for instance. And I'd hate to see it that essentially the traditional city centre areas essentially take up all of the cash, because they score really well on an IMD perspective.
Thanks. We'll move on. I've got Councillor Hook next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Gradually, as people are talking, I've been adding questions and points I want to make, not so much questions as points, but like the 300-metre radius, I think that should be extended where there's no choice beyond that 300 metres. But as Councillor Vassey mentioned, so some people have to walk a kilometre or a mile, whatever, to get to the nearest play area. You really should extend the radius to cover those people as well, especially if it's a poorer estate. The big thing that concerns me, because I'm very aware from the play area equipment we bought in my ward, using ward funding money back in the good old days, they can cost about 5,000–7,000 a piece, so it doesn't go very far. And you get that horrible feeling that you might end up with areas that the play equipment's so old and not that good that it almost becomes like a little ghetto that nobody wants to go to, apart from people for nefarious purposes. And it becomes exactly the opposite of a friendly, family-friendly park. So sometimes that should be quite a high criteria, because that's exactly what you don't want. And some of those places I'm a bit concerned, could be where you've built a new estate and the developers put it in. So how much influence do you have over the developers to upgrade the equipment? Because after the estate's been there for, the one I know best that's an old one is Poppleton Park. that gets older and older and older, but it's not in a deprived area, but it might end up being a little ghetto right in the middle of an estate that people say, oh God, we don't even want you to improve it because that'll encourage people with nefarious purposes to come. But it's that concern that, have you got any clout to say to the former developers, look, you know, you did that, you've got a responsibility to keep maintaining it, and then we can get the money from them rather than from anyone else. And last but not least, also speaking from my experiences in Poppleton Park, they actually use the fence areas for ball games, because that when the way the ball is, especially when other people don't want to use the play equipment because it's so old, but it's a good place for a ball game because then the ball can't escape onto the road and dangerous places like that. And I just wonder whether the facility of areas for ball games that's protected and safe from traffic and smashing people's windows is also something just to bear in mind, not, you know, because people like kicking balls around, don't they?
Can I just check Poppleton Park? I would call it S Drive. Is that what you? S Drive is owned by the council. No, it's owned by us. Sorry about that. But if there's a council site that we're probably not invested in since it was given to us as part of the planning process. Unfortunately, I think people use the phrase, race to the bottom. A lot of the funding has been driven by like the worst historically. That we've focused on sites that were of a poorer quality in the past. And unfortunately, then eventually somebody else becomes the bottom of the list. Which, using this without Patrick was saying, that prejudice, for example, criteria 2, it may score quite highly. Fencing, very mindful of it. There's no, and picking up council fences, there's no desire to remove fencing that's unnecessary, that serves a function. That was meant to highlight that in a few places I know fencing is just actually creates the ghetto type you were referring to, or the no-go, or just feeling doesn't look how it should do. So it's just part of that wider picture of which you're sort of steering us towards, the wider picture of accessibility and impact and being welcome and inclusive for all users.
Thanks. I've got Councillor Baxter, please, and then.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on a couple. Oh, I've just gone to the completely wrong page. A couple of the criterias. Sorry, I'm trying to find my place again now. About the funding, where that's coming from. Obviously very pleased to see Hull Road Park mentioned in there, and very grateful for the hours that Dave has spent in the park over the last couple of years, and Councillor Kent too. But I just wondered if you could sort of more on a wider point explain how the new officer will sort of interact with things like getting green flag status, and how that they can have that sort of focus on accessibility. I know it's obviously really important and was mentioned by the public speaker, and I know that in my park we had a couple of the accessible picnic tables made by our volunteers with TCV, which is a really good partnership, and it's really positive to see. It was unfortunately burnt down by some youth, but it'd just be really helpful to know how that officer will interact with things like funding bids, working with people like TCV and other charities that we have in my park and in other parks across the city.
It's really too early to answer that question. However, so the Green Flag Award requires two things. It needs a written management plans, and within that there's a development plan. So I've got a fair idea what needs to be developed, improved, acted upon within that park. Plus we've got our partners with things like St Nick's and TCV already, plus we've now got the Friends of Hull Road Park. So there's a sort of network there that to draw upon to develop an action plan for the park. There are a couple of infrastructure things that need doing, and if they score suitably, then that would be a recommendation later on that those are target areas for the spend. But you need a park that's got most things in a fairly good nick. So that it's the second part I'd envisage the new role taken on, with me, given the timings and previous experience, unless this person's got the same experience of green flag, I would lead on this coordination and the entry for any kind of award. They would lead on the implementation of the investment to achieve, to tick off the things that need ticking off, if it scores.
Yeah, I think just really to add to that is very much the vision for the project officer or manager that comes in, that they can absolutely focus and put all their time and effort into the delivery. Once the criteria is set and agreed and we know exactly where the locations are, wherever that may be, you know, they may have some relationships and work with other officers in the council or cross council, cross service, but that will free up Dave's time to work with those. He's got those relationships already. He knows the standard of green flag. So that's very much of that new post is in terms of delivery, really.
Thanks. Did you have another question, Councillor Whitcroft? You had said you might have another one later on.
Yeah, it was covered slightly by Councillor Coles there, just around voluntary groups. I appreciate that there's the complexity there, where if an area has a lot of voluntary groups that might be able to help in the upkeep of the park, that might make it more viable for investment. But then we don't want to discourage areas that don't have those voluntary groups that rely on the council. I just want to understand sort of the nuances there, and how we can make sure that we make best use of the voluntary groups, like the ones we've got for Cemetery Road, for example, whilst also making sure that other areas of the city without voluntary groups aren't disproportionately affected. Appreciate it's a bit of a complicated one there, but I was wondering if there's any thoughts in how we might best consider the criteria with that frame of mind.
I think I'd go back to Councillor Fenton's comment. Really, it was the one about consultation. So once we know where the spend is, sorry, it might not be the way you answer your question. Once we know where the spend is, then we can work out who the partners can be and who the partners are. If a site, if a site is highlighted for spend that has no friends, isn't loved by anybody, then we work through you guys, through again the Ecos, through our other partners, York Cares, to try and find friends. So I wouldn't want to do an audit. I wouldn't want to have one of the criteria, does this site have anybody else to partner? Because that's a massive piece of work, you know. But once we've got the sites, then I'd certainly be looking to make best value either existing or creating new friends and partners to work on a site.
Councillor Kent, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think Dave won't thank me for saying this, but I have ambitions around this as well, which is this is a capital fund, which is largely on stuff and things, but parks and green spaces are plants and green spaces and biodiversity. And so I also have an ambition that we can improve that through partnering with existing volunteer groups and partners, but also directing other partners in the city like Your Cares to places where that doesn't exist, to improve the whole feel of the place, including planting. And Dave won't thank me, but tree planting as well for shade. But that's to be worked on.
Thanks, Councillor Healy. You have the last question today.
Super quick one. Picking up on Councillor Myers' earlier point about the play strategy, from an officer's perspective and an executive member's perspective, do you think that'd be suitable for task and finish group for this committee? Yes, no, maybe.
I don't even know we have one.
Sorry?
I wasn't aware we had one. It's just made a real limited statement there, but no, I think there's play strategy is generally right on. Some comes out of early years, and playgrounds are only one part of a play strategy, and I suspect it's a very long time that we've had a play strategy, let alone a playground strategy.
For my part, I'd really welcome it, because this is something that if we do have one, it's ancient and things have changed. And also I'm really aware, in looking at this, that a lot of the talk is about sort of physical traditional play equipment, but that's a sort of that is a narrow view of what play is, and I'd like to look at it in a much broader way, and much more inclusive of things like forest schools and natural environment and all aspects of play, really. So I'd really welcome it.
Thanks. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'll move on to recommendations. I've got three broadly that I seem to have noted, but I'll go through these, and if anyone wants to add any, just let me know. First one was accessibility, both as a decision point, so for executive to consider whether that is part of the criteria in terms of lack of access, and then secondly, as also as part of the scope of works when it comes to actually looking at where the money is spent on each park, whether that's what we spend the money on. Number two was around the actual access to the space itself. So this idea of only looking at IMDs within 300 metres, but if that's the park, the only park covering the next 1,000 metres, then that wider area should be taken into consideration. So I think that's another one to think about. And the last ask would be around this question of, I guess you'd call them destination parks. So things like Homestead Park and Rowntree Park, and again, how things around quite niche geographical things like IMD impacts on the selection criteria for them when actually they're being used by a much higher level of footfall than small local parks. So yeah, that's the three I've got. Does anyone have anything else they wanted to add to that list? Councillor Kent, want to add to your own workload to this today?
Can I just ask, I think this is apparent, but can I just clarify, in terms of taking in a greater area for what you've called destination parks, are you saying that should have a higher weighting if there's greater use? I just wanted to check, or lower. I just want to be really clear that we've taken that the right way.
If you take the city, you break it down into its IMDs, you put your destination parks on it, and then essentially you expand their boundaries until they all start to meet. You then take, instead of the IMDs within a 300-metre radius, you take the IMDs within that boundary.
Which might have the effect of lowering the score for a city park. I don't know. I just wasn't sure if you thought whether a different criteria, what the criteria you were suggesting was usage rather than so IMD is one aspect, but actually population density or usage is another.
Yeah.
You see the difference?
I think it's a fairly broad recommendation, because it's the tricky thing about using these frameworks, isn't it? Because if you make it footfall, then small parks that are underused in remote areas won't get any funding, but then likewise, if it's a big park but it's in a rich area, then it's also not getting any funding. So it's just how you balance them two things off, isn't it? So it's takeaway to think about. Sorry, Dave, wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think I understand the logic. What I will need to do is obviously talk to colleagues in business intelligence to see how adaptable the mapping system is to produce that sort of data. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I saw another hand. Was it over here? Yeah, Councillor Vassy, and I'll come to you.
There was just to broaden that access point that you've made, the second point you made there, Chair, to make sure that we don't forget those smaller communities that can find themselves a kilometre away from anything and without any public transport links. I understand all the waiting, but the various forms of waiting that we're talking about, but there is always that risk that groups of 30 or 40 houses or 100 houses that are far away from somewhere slip under the net all the time. So I hope that the criteria will factor that in to make sure that we're not losing particular groups.
Yeah, noted. I think we can pick that up in there. Councillor Myers.
I mean, I was just going to suggest that, because I agree with Councillor Ely's point about the destination parks, but I don't have the answer for that either. They're going to show an anomaly on the criteria as it is, and I guess if the committee's aware of that, then officers and the executive can be made aware of that by attendance here and hearing that. And I'd be keen to see what business intelligence pulls out at first phase so that we could look at that when it's published. But I don't have the answer, but I want to also double up and say that could be an anomaly.
Yeah, thanks. Noted. Okay, I think we've got some good recommendations there to take forward, so I'll pick that up. But yeah, thanks for your time. I'm aware that annual leave and being asked to pull reports together and everything else can be tricky, so thanks for getting it all done in time for this one. So yeah, thanks, and we'll move on to the next item. Cheers. Yeah. All right, we'll just take a short break, so we'll give it call it 5 minutes. People back. We'll make a return. So we'll go on to the last item, which is work plan. Obviously, in a bit of a transitional period at the moment. We are talking about having a private meeting to kind of finalise the details of the work plan as well in July before we settle it entirely. But we've still got this item here. If I take this as an opportunity, we've got Guy Close, Democratic Services Manager here. If you just wanted to speak through a little bit about what the new committees looks like and what we're asking for at this time.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Well, I thought it might be helpful just to set out some context in terms of the work plan that's been presented before you. So members will recall that there was a review by the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny that resulted in a revised approach to scrutiny with a much greater focus on undertaking more in-depth pieces of work through the work of task and finish groups, resulting in specific recommendations. So the intention is that reports that have kind of previously been submitted largely for information purposes, that these are to be considered through informal briefing sessions. And the format of these can take many forms, through information updates, presentations, or informal meetings, either in person or online. These briefings will then inform whether further, more detailed scrutiny activity is required, potentially through the work of task and finish groups. So members will note that the committee's work plan that's been presented before you today includes a list of unallocated items which have been transferred across from the former scrutiny committees that now fall within the committee's remit. So as the chair's perhaps already alluded to, whilst not necessarily a decision for today's meeting, members will need to give consideration to those areas which are best suited to potential task and finish groups, briefing sessions, and areas of pre-decision scrutiny. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the something to consider is in terms of task and finish group. I think we've talked about probably having capacity as a Democratic Services team to run kind of 1 to 2 maximum as a committee at one time. So I think that's just something to be mindful of. And I think the other thing for us to be mindful of is the fact that we are obviously moving to 2 public committee every 2 months rather than every month. And we've obviously had a number of months already since the latest political year. So we're looking at we spoke about this yesterday, Councillor Healy, Vice Chair. We've got a limited number of public committee meetings and we're looking to do some quite chunky items in those. So there is going to have to be quite a lot of prioritisation and I guess cutting from this long list in terms of what we actually take forward for deep, detailed discussion and pre-decision scrutiny where we think we can make the most impact, and perhaps some of the items where we don't think that can either go to a private briefing or may just have to be removed as half an hour or pushed back to the next year. So I think that's where we are looking at the moment. And I think another good thing today, just for today, because we have got this private session, not really looking for absolute detail on all of these and which ones you want to see. I think mainly anything that you would like to be added, it would also be useful to hear from Patrick potentially on any steer on this in case you can't make the next meeting. Yeah, and then specifically on the task and finish group, any detailed thoughts that you have on what that might be, if anyone would like to put that forward for discussion at the next private meeting as well. But I'll leave that there. I'll open the floor up now, but just some things to be mindful of for this discussion. Councillor Whitcroft and Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief question around the format before we move to suggestions. Would the purpose of a task and finish group in this instance be to then report back to the main committee at one of these public sessions? So that's the process it would be. Is that the idea?
Yeah, there'll be additional sessions set aside, obviously, for it taking place, but we'll report back to the committee.
Thank you. Right, in that case, in a massive surprise to absolutely no one, I would like to propose that we look at parking in relation to, here we go, in relation to task and finish as a suggestion. I think in particularly working with the executive members, looking at the sort of a parking plan for the whole city, which I think we could really do with some scrutiny feedback. I also think it's an area that we could work on very well on a cross-party basis, pooling our knowledge on the area. It's a large enough topic, I think, for us to be able to warrant either a full committee item or a task and finish group with a then report back. And I think if we can build some sort of consensus on this committee, then parking could hopefully become less of a political hot potato and something we can actually do something about.
Thanks, that's helpful. A supplementary on this, yeah.
Full council voted and passed your motion. I can't see how us doing another piece of work in a task and finish group should in any way carry more weight or move this topic forward than a full council motion. Now, if we got to the point where full council motions mean as little as seems to be happened here, then we need to go back to the constitution and have a look at full council motions. But we've given quite a few bites to this cherry now, and I sense your frustration that it's not moving forward. I'm just wondering the effort we put in will move it forward as you wish to see, and I'll let others comment.
I do know what you mean. I think, but I guess it's what that parking bit is. If it's a detailed work on a specific proposal or idea behind parking and what that could look like, then I think there's potentially value in it in terms of saying, you know, is it about expanding Res Park? Is that a specific task and finish group rather than it just being the broad concept of parking? But we can have it for discussion. I mean, obviously there's going to have to be a certain amount of prioritisation between things like there's only going to be probably one initially, task and finish group that will be taken forward, and then so we can take it forward for prioritisation, I guess, and discussion at the next meeting to clarify that.
Yeah, if I may, Chair, I do appreciate that, and yeah, I've got a lot of powerful frustration that I think a lot of people can tell, not least of all my residents. I do appreciate it. The motion was very much sort of a broad perspective on trying to address the issue specifically on resident parking within the city. I was hoping we could have a broader discussion about the different kinds of parking, but also drilling down on specifically what needs to be done. Maybe it's because my motion wasn't specific enough, but they tend to be broader. I think it might also be worth engaging, and I can do this with the executive member for transport to see how far down we've got with parking. But yeah, I do appreciate that, Councillor. Thanks for your solidarity.
Thanks. Councillor Fenton, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm sure you don't want to get into a line by line discussion on everything on the list. I think pages 19 to 22 gives us a really good starting point in terms of, you know, to add to that, any suggestions or requests you get from meetings that you have with officers and executive members where they are saying, for example, we have a local transport strategy implementation plan. It includes these short-term commitments. These ones will be coming forward. We would like to bring them to your committee ahead of a decision being made on parking provision, as an example. So some of the answers may come from those discussions. But I think this gives us a good start. And I think when you've had those conversations and you've got those items that suggestions will hopefully inform the agendas for the public meetings. Yeah. It's then going through this and saying, well, can we have a briefing on Dial and Ride, for example? Because I'm sure we're all aware it's exactly 1 year since the cross-party task and finish group on Dial and Ride reported back to this committee. And it'd be really nice to know what is happening on the back of that. And I think for me and others to have confidence in the new system and task and finish groups that we're all being encouraged to join, and I've already put myself forward for one of them, there has to be evidence of an output from that work. Because if we do this work, produce a task and finish group report, and then nothing happens, there's a risk that members' enthusiasm will wane, and I think we want to avoid that. But I think this is a good lengthy and detailed list if we can add to it, and then yourself and the vice chair do that prioritisation so that we can have the discussions when they need to happen in order to inform the decisions that are going to be made or to inform the policy development that's happening. Then I think we're hopefully in a good place.
Yeah, understood. And I think should hopefully be able to bring hopefully some of that prioritisation from officers even to the next meeting to help people have some of those conversations. I mean, there's ones on here, for example, like a couple of conversations really, things like assets of community value, things that have been requested before, but a lot of that is actually from the background of members wanting to understand more about how they work. So it definitely falls into the briefing category rather than it being something that the council has a huge input into already. But yeah, understood. Councillor Myers.
Thank you, Chair. I'll make a brief pitch for an area that I want to focus on, because I'm not sure actually if it's this committee or not, but I think it is, because housing's across both committees. But I did want to look at short-term holiday lets in the city as a deep dive, really. And I think it is this committee with its focus on planning, services and strategic housing. I've seen a number of other authorities undertake this type of work, and it allows them from a strong evidence base to lobby government and others and to build the case essentially for a national change in legislation, but also to demonstrate that they're ready to implement. And I think with that in mind, it'd be a really useful piece of work, and from my perspective, residents would welcome councillors' attention on this. Yeah, there's a lot out there that we can learn from, and I think we could have a look at that.
Yeah, thoroughly agree. Yeah, if we take away as an action to check exactly which committee it sits under, but I agree it needs to be on one of them basically. Surprising we haven't seen it too much. Here's this one. Yeah, probably falls into this one. Yeah. Okay. I'd probably pick it up in a meeting. The main one that stands out to me, and I kind of a little bit of a question to you, Patrick, while we've got you here, is around. It's kind of covered under one of these, but it's more around kind of so it says review of CYC's property asset portfolio, but I guess how do we actually, at the moment, we kind of get broad update reports. And I guess this is also a question for committee consideration. We normally get a lot of update reports that come here, which having the limited amounts of committees we have now might have to become public reports that are published but might not be reviewed every quarter, for example, because we're limited on meetings when to do them. But things like we receive a lot of data, but we haven't often seen things around the actual physical assets we own and what the strategy is behind them. We've seen quite broad brush strategies, but not kind of the detail of, I guess in my place of work, there'd be a property committee that has a full list of all the vacant properties in the city and how we actually deal with those going forwards. A lot of those have been vacant for a long time in York now, and more oversight of that, or potential for discussion about how we might provide oversight of that in the city going forward. Yeah, I think that was it.
Well, I suppose it depends which bit you're looking at, because the commercial portfolio on the whole is for investment. It's for sort of generating revenues that support council services. So we obviously own a large number of shops, relatively low levels of vacancies in most of those areas. But we also hold a number of assets which we're setting aside for example, the housing delivery programme. So I guess it's understanding from your perspective which bits of understanding do you want. There's certainly not a problem with inviting Nick Collins along to one of your private briefings and giving you a bit more of an understanding as to what is in the commercial portfolio, what returns it does, how we prioritise whether or not we retain the assets or seek to sell. Because they're the sort of day-to-day decisions that himself and that team are making alongside the sort of strategic position that the council's got. So yeah, that might be a useful briefing that you have in one of these areas, and sort of might lead you to an area and sort of say, oh, that's really interesting, kind of find out a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think that's probably accurate, because I suspect this has been on the list for a while and been brought up by speakers before, but I think sometimes it's a bit too intangible to know where to even dig into it. So maybe a briefing's a good place to start and then work out where to go from there. Not seeing any of your hands on this. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything further. Oh yeah, sorry. We were also got specifically on this. I don't know if I just want to ask if she. Yeah, we have got Pauline Stutchfield joining us online as the director. I don't know if you've got anything else you wanted to raise, Pauline. If not, we'll.
Hi, Chair. Hello, Chair. Yeah, Pauline Stutchfield, Director of Housing and Communities. Apologies, I can't be there tonight. Just to mention that, yeah, Right to Buy certainly fits across strategic housing and economy, and is of current interest within the press at the minute. The other area that we've been standing by on transition from the last scrutinies was the request to bring the new library needs assessment and early engagement consultation feedback to committee. This is a for information report, so something for you to consider, I guess, for one of the briefing sessions. That this is not the only opportunity for scrutiny to be involved in the library strategy and library savings process. There will be future consultation opportunities and pre-scrutiny in the autumn as well.
Great, thank you. That's useful additional information. Okay, I'm not seeing anything further, so we'll call it to a close there. So we've got plenty noted down to take forward to the next session. But yeah, thanks for everyone's time, and we'll end it there.